Is this a place that I like? Is this one I want to stay in? Do I want to come back here? Do I want to take all the actions that I take in a hotel when I'm on a trip here, or would I rather be someplace else? People don't think much of this. It doesn't enter into their calculations very much. It doesn't enter into their calculations very much, but it's a very important element, the physical context. Then there is, of course, the psychological context. Every individual human being is psychologically different from every other human being, all 7 billion of them, or however many there are at the present time. You have different motivations, you have different emotions, you have different life experiences that have affected your psychology in different ways. All of that is very significant, obviously, in all economic acts. The very fact that you may have been frightened when you were a child by a dog that was a black, for example, and that ever since that time you resist black things. For instance, if you go to a store, you're not likely to pick an item which is packaged in black. You may have a preference for red or yellow or green or whatever the case may be, and that may have something to do with your life experience. It may have something to do with your culture, and we'll go into that in a moment. Everyone is different from everybody else, and all human action takes place in a psychological context. And when you put together hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands or millions or tens of millions of people, each with a separate psychology, you have an incredibly complex situation where every individual is operating on the basis of a different set of motivations and emotions from every other one. Now, some people are similar to other people in their motivations and emotions. Some are quite different from other people. But in an organization that has 10,000 members, I can assure you, you are going to get a very wide range of psychologies. All human action, or almost all human action, takes place in a social context. It takes place in a context where either you are with other people, or what you do is affected by the fact that you have been with other people, and that has affected your psyche. Organizations interact with other organizations. Organizations are made up of people. The people interact with each other in their own organization and in other organizations. The social context is ubiquitous. It's everywhere. You can't avoid it unless you're a hermit in the middle of a jungle somewhere, or the middle of a desert, and there's nobody else around for miles. How many hermits are there in the world? Of the billions of people in the world? I don't know. 10, 20, 50. I doubt if there are as many as 50. It's unimportant. It's insignificant. For all practical purposes, all human action takes place in a social context, or more accurately, in multiple social contexts. Just think of all the organizations you, as individuals, belong to. You belong to a family. You may belong to various families. The family of your parents. The family where you are the parents. Your extended family. Your cousins and aunts and uncles and nephews and nieces and all the rest of that crew. You're students at the Institute of World Politics, which is an organization. Much of what you do is affected by the fact that you are a student at the Institute of World Politics. You may work in another organization. Much of what you do is obviously affected by what you do in that organization. your interaction with the other people in the organization, each of whom has his or her own psychology, as I'm sure you found out very quickly. And all the different bureaus and departments and groups in that organization interact with each other, sometimes in a cooperative fashion, sometimes in a conflictive fashion, usually in a combined fashion, which is true of most human action. The organization you work for interacts with other organizations, either in its own field or in other fields. It may interact with the Institute. The Institute may interact with other educational institutions. It may interact with commercial. It does interact with commercial organizations. It interacts with governmental organizations. Governmental organizations interact constantly with organizations of the private sector, civil society, business groups, labor groups, professional groups, trade groups, etc., etc., etc. Thousands, tens of thousands. Society is complex, very complex. And all human action takes place in a political context. Conflict is everywhere. The use of power is ubiquitous. People are using the various forms of power, physical power and social power, from persuasion to advanced weaponry and everything in between, all the time, constantly. But how they do it is affected by their psychology, by their group, by their multiple groups in many cases, and, importantly, also by their culture. Again, this is an element that is not sufficiently given sufficient attention. Almost all human beings exist within a particular culture, not just society. There are all these different multiple groups in society that we've been talking about, and the social interaction is everywhere. But a Frenchman is not like a Japanese, who is not like a Thai, who is not like an Argentinian, who is not like an Irishman, who is not like a Canadian, etc., etc., etc. Culture is important. Culture affects all the other elements. It affects your psychology. It affects your social interactions and how you do them and how you behave and the kinds of actions you take place. It affects your use of power. It affects your use of wealth. Culture is made up of many different elements. The most important are history and tradition. The reason a Frenchman is different from a Japanese is because the history and traditions of France are different from the history and traditions of Japan, and are manifested in many, many ways, such as food, such as clothing, such as manners. Frenchmen do not generally bow to each other. Japanese do it all the time. Does it matter? Yes, it does matter, because it is a part of the culture of the two groups, which can affect the way they take actions and how they behave. For example, just to take one example, a Japanese subordinate is more likely than a French subordinate to follow an order by his superior that he finds morally or ethically repugnant. The Japanese is more likely to do it anyhow, even if he finds it repugnant, than the Frenchman. The Frenchman is more likely to say, no, sorry, I'm not going to do that. And that's an element of culture. Now, if a French baby is taken to Japan and brought up by a Japanese household, he or she is Japanese from the standpoint of culture. The same is true if a Japanese baby is taken to France and brought up by a French household. He or she is, from the cultural standpoint, French, not Japanese. So it's not purely an ethnic concept. Ethnicity is an element of culture sometimes, but not always. History and tradition is always an element of culture, always. Okay, I'm back on. One of these weeks we will actually conquer all of these glitches, but anyway. So all human action takes place in a cultural context. Why am I going into all of this? The physical, the psychological, the social, the political, the cultural, and of course the economic context. It's because you must keep in mind always, whenever you analyze an economic matter, whenever you take an economic action, you must not ignore all of these other elements if they affect the action that you're analyzing or the action that you're thinking of taking. Otherwise, it will not be effective because it will be partial. It will be effective only to the extent that you're lucky, in other words, by chance. And let me just take one simple but very recent example. The psychological, social, political, and cultural contexts of the invasion of Iraq were, to a very large extent, ignored. And cost-benefit analysis was either absent or extremely faulty. Faulty because these other aspects were not taken into consideration to the extent that they should have been. Now, partially this had to do with what was the definition of benefit in this case. The cost, okay, it's going to cost so much, or we think it's going to cost so much to invade Iraq. What are we trying to do? Overthrow Saddam? We did that in 3 weeks. If that was the benefit we were looking for, and then we would have found some pliant general and said, okay, you run the place and hold local elections in a year and provincial elections in 2 years and write a constitution and so on and so forth, and it's all yours, and we'll decapitate the armed forces and the police and the civil service, the bureaucrats, but leave everybody else in place. We didn't do any of those things. First of all, we never properly defined what it is we were trying to do. So instead of being in Iraq for 3 weeks, of course it would have taken a while to get out, so let's say 2 months. Instead of being in Iraq for 2 months, we were in Iraq for years. We overthrow Saddam, and all of a sudden we find that we're trying to implant democracy in a place where the culture, which we didn't bother to find out about, has no place for Western liberal democracy as we understand it. So we spent years, an untold treasure in human lives, to try to accomplish something that wasn't going to be accomplished because of extremely faulty cost-benefit analysis. And because we didn't bother to understand or to try to understand the various interacting contexts within which our actions took place. What did we accomplish in Iraq? Well, we got rid of Saddam Hussein. Okay, terrific. Was he a national security threat to the United States? Think about it. Was he a very bad man? Yes. Are there lots of bad people in the world? Yes. Do we try to eliminate all of them? No. In the case of Saddam, was he a threat to his neighbors? Yes. Was he a threat to his own people? Yes. Was he a threat to us? I leave that to you. What could or would he have done to us? In the first Gulf War, what he could and tried to do was to control the head of the Persian Gulf and the oil supply. So we took action. The action was quick and it was over, and we had a lot of allies, and we got out. And he was not able to control the oil supply from the Gulf. Okay. That was an example of good cost-benefit analysis. And we didn't have to understand the psychology and the sociology and the culture of the people of Iraq, because we weren't going to be there long enough to have it make any difference. But if you're going to be in a place for years trying to affect their economic and political, and particularly their political and cultural structure, you better understand what it is in the first place, and whether you have any likelihood of success in accomplishing what you've all of a sudden decided that's what you're interested in doing. But I want to take something even simpler. In the case of the first Gulf War, the cost-benefit analysis had to do with a very obvious benefit. It had to do with an objective that was well defined. Get the Iraqis out of Kuwait so they can't threaten the Gulf states and Saudi Arabia. We did it and we left. In the case of the invasion of Iraq in the 90s, we never went through the simple process of deciding what it is we wanted to do, or finding out how it might be done, or whether it was even likely to be possible. What were the economic effects? We know what the political effects are in Iraq. Right now, the most influential country in Iraq is not the United States. It's Iran. And we have very serious problems with Iran. And so do a lot of other countries in the world, including our Gulf allies. We turned Iraq, or a large part of it, over to Iran at the cost of tens of billions of dollars and thousands of lives. This is an example which, if it was given as a case study, people wouldn't believe it, and they would say, "Oh, that's nonsense. You're taking an extreme case, you're setting up a straw man, and you're destroying it." I think you would find that somebody in 2003, if you told them that we were going to be in Iraq for years, almost a decade, they would say, well, first of all, why are you doing it? And secondly, okay, you've decided you want to overthrow Saddam, even though he's no national security threat to the United States. We don't know why you want to do this, but okay, you want to do it. Do it, get it over with, and leave. At least you won't have used up a lot of resources. This is precisely the kind of thing that you, in the future, are going to be faced with in your careers. And it's not just economics, and it's not just politics. It has a great deal to do with the physical context, in other words, geography, the psychological, sociological, and cultural context within which all of your actions and all of your organization's actions and all of your country's actions are going to take place. And the more you understand this, and the more you deal with it in an intelligent and rational fashion, the more valuable you're going to be to your country, to your organization, and to yourself. All of the principles that I'm talking about here are principles that can be applied across the board. It's important to understand the principles. It's important to understand the theory, because everything is based on the principles and the theories. But just as the basement of a building is not the building itself, the theories and the principles are not the entire reality. And in some cases, they may be a relatively small aspect of reality. In other words, the perversion of the act of exchange or of the productive process may be such that the simple act of exchange is so totally perverted, that the productive process is so totally perverted as it was, for example, in as it still is in communist countries, that the true economic element is almost absent. Nevertheless, by understanding the theory and the principles, you will be able to understand why exchange doesn't work well in certain contexts, why the productive process doesn't work well in certain contexts, why there are constant shortages in the Soviet Union of just about everything people wanted, and why so much of the process of simple exchange takes place in a context where the exchange is of much less value to the people engaging in the acts of exchange than it would be if more attention were paid to why it's taking place and what you're trying to accomplish by it. Okay, we are now moving on to the concepts of supply and demand. And you have the supply and demand curves that I sent in and which you were given. I would appreciate it if you would take them out now and put them in front of you. Look at the top one, which is a simple supply and demand map. The vertical axis is price. The horizontal axis is quantity, or Q. One of they're not curves, they're straight lines simply because it's easier to deal with, is demand, and the other one is supply. Where the demand curve intersects with the supply curve is where that particular quantity will be produced at that particular price, which is called the equilibrium price, or the price at which the market is cleared. In other words, all of the products, the quantity is purchased at that price. That's the equilibrium price. It clears the market. Okay? Now, what is the basis of supply and demand